The morning my daughter-in-law Lena changed the code on the barn door and told me I was no longer allowed inside. She said it with a smile that almost seemed kind. "It's just a precaution, Hilda," she said. "The floor in there is uneven. I'd never forgive myself if you fell." I looked past her at the old red barn my husband Vernon had built with his own hands over two summers. His woodworking tools were still on the shelves in there. So were the notebooks he kept in the final year of his life. Project journals, he called them, though I knew they were something more personal than that. A man doesn't write about his apple trees in the careful, deliberate hand Vernon used without meaning every word. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to reconsider. I said all right and walked back across the yard to my guest cabin, and I let Lena believe that the conversation was finished. What she didn't know, what no one had thought to mention to her, was that 31 years earlier, Vernon had registered a farm lane easement with the Frontenac County Township. It ran along the back boundary of our property, through the tree line, and opened directly behind the barn. He had done it quietly, practically, the way he did everything. "You never know when you might need another way in," he told me once, back when the easement still mattered for the neighbor's equipment. Lena had changed one lock. She had forgotten to ask about the other door. Before I tell you what I found on the other side of that barn, I want to tell you about the property itself, because you need to understand what she was trying to take before you can understand what she nearly got away with. Vernon and I bought our 5 acres outside of Kingston, Ontario, in the spring of 1988. Noel was 3 years old, still small enough to ride on Vernon's shoulders, while we walked the overgrown fence lines, trying to decide if this was the place. The farmhouse was drafty, and the porch leaned, and the backfield was nothing but wild grass and milkweed. But Vernon stood at the edge of it in his work boots, with Noel asleep against his shoulder, and he said, "We could plant an orchard here." That was how it started. We were not wealthy people. Vernon was a Finnish carpenter, and I taught at the elementary school 2 townships over. We fixed the house ourselves, room by room, year by year. Vernon chinked the gaps in the walls before our second winter. He leveled the porch the summer after that. He built the barn when Noel was in grade 4, working on weekends with materials he salvaged and purchased slowly, not rushing it. The barn went up board by board, the way everything good in our life was built, without shortcuts, without debt we couldn't afford. The apple trees came in stages. We planted the first 6 Cortlands along the south fence when Noel started school. I chose apple trees because they take years to produce, and I wanted something that required patience. I wanted to plant something I believed we'd still be standing next to in 20 years. Those Cortlands grew. The following spring we added Gallus. The year Noel graduated high school, Vernon planted 2 Macintosh trees near the center of the orchard and carved a small notch into the bark of one. His version of marking the occasion. I pretended to scold him, and he laughed and said, "I didn't do it to the fence post, did I?" Every tree in that orchard had a year attached to it in my memory. The Honeycrisp near the gate went in the summer we paid off the property. The northern spy by the barn wall was planted the autumn. Vernon's mother passed because he said she loved apple pie more than almost anything else, and he wanted something to remember her by. When Nell was born, our only grandchild, Noel's daughter, Vernon planted a small ambrosia tree at the edge of the orchard and said, "One day she'll be tall enough to pick from this herself." He said it with such certainty, as if the future were simply a thing you decided. Vernon developed heart trouble in his mid-60s. His doctor told him to rest, to reduce the physical work, to stop hauling lumber. Vernon reduced his client list and refused to stop going into the orchard. He sat in the low folding chair he kept near the tool shed and told me which branches needed pruning from a safe distance. "You missed one," he would call out. "I can see it from here." He was almost always right. In his final autumn, he could not walk the full length of the orchard anymore. We would go as far as the ambrosia tree, Nell's tree, and sit together on the wooden bench he had made years before. The smell of ripe apples in October, the wasps working the fallen ones, the quiet of Frontenac County in late season. "This is enough," he said once. "The tree?" I asked. "All of it," he said. "This was enough for a life." He died in November, 5 years before the morning. Lena changed the code on the barn. The silence of that first winter without him was not the kind you get used to. It lived in the house with me. It sat in his chair. It waited on the porch steps. I kept busy with the orchard because the orchard still needed tending, and because work had always been the thing that kept me from sinking. Noel began visiting more. He would drive up from Ottawa on weekends and help with what he could, and after a few months he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said that he was worried about me managing the property alone. "The acreage alone is a lot for one person, Mum," he said. He wasn't wrong. Lena sat beside him. She covered my hand with hers and said, "We'd never crowd you. You'd have your own space. We just want to be closer." The guest cabin at the back of the yard had been Vernon's workshop before his tools moved to the barn. Noel offered to convert it into a proper small home for me. Private entrance, its own heat, its own kitchen. "You'd be 10 steps from the orchard," he said. Nothing would change. I thought about the silence of the main house. I thought about Noel as a child following Vernon through the rows with a small plastic rake. I said yes. I gave Noel the house key when they moved in. I did not transfer the property. I had not thought clearly about why. It simply did not feel like the right moment. But Vernon had been careful about this before he died, more careful than I knew at the time. For the first several months, the arrangement felt like what they had promised. Lena brought coffee to the cabin on Sunday mornings. She asked about the trees. She walked through the orchard with me once or twice and commented on how much work it must have been to plant it all. "How much do you think the land is worth now?" she asked on one of those walks, and I thought she meant it as appreciation. The way you look at something someone built and marvel that it exists. I understand now that she was measuring. The changes began quietly, the way these things always do. One afternoon I came into the main house and found the fireplace mantel cleared. Vernon's photograph, the one from our trip to Cape Breton, where he's grinning in front of a lighthouse, was gone. The small framed picture of Noel at age 7, missing his 2 front teeth, was gone. In their place were 3 matching white candles and a piece of driftwood. "Just freshening things up," Lena said when I asked. I found the photos in a box in the storage room off the mudroom. Not wrapped, not protected, just stacked. I carried Vernon's Cape Breton photograph back to the mantel and set it there. The next morning, it was in the box again. I didn't say anything. I went back to my cabin and I sat at the table, and I told myself I was imagining the weight of what was happening. I almost believed it. The Sunday dinners stopped first. Then, the casual drop-ins. By the following spring, I could go 3 or 4 days without seeing either of them except at a distance through the kitchen window. Noel was working long hours managing a regional construction project. He left early and came home tired. When he was home, Lena was attentive and warm, and she would sometimes mention my name in conversation in a way that made me feel included from a careful remove. "Hilda's done so much for this property," she would say to Noel. The past tense was always there. I tried twice to speak with Noel privately. Both times we were interrupted. Once by Lena appearing with a question that couldn't wait, once by Noel's phone ringing at a convenient moment. The third time, I caught him alone in the driveway. "I feel like something is shifting," I told him. "And I can't get you alone long enough to say so." He looked tired. "Mum, Lena's just trying to make the house feel like hers. That's normal." "I know that," I said. "But it still is my house, Noel." He hesitated just a breath too long. "Of course it is." That pause was the first crack. Nell came to see me the following week. She was 15 then. Quiet in the way that means a person is paying close attention. She knocked on the cabin door and slipped inside and sat at my kitchen table, with her hands pressed flat on the surface, the way she does when she's working up to something. "Grandma," she said, "I heard Mum on the phone." I made us both tea. I didn't rush her. Lena had been on the phone in the upstairs study, Nell said, with the door most of the way closed. Nell had been in the hall. She hadn't meant to listen, but she had. She said, "The back acreage is the valuable part," Nell told me. "Once we move forward, the orchard is the first thing to go." I set my cup down. Did she say anything else? Nell looked at her hands. She said, "Once Noel signs, it's done." And then she said your name. She said you wouldn't be a problem much longer. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, I could see the orchard. The ambrosia tree Nell's own grandfather had planted the year she was born. The Cortlands along the south fence, gnarled and generous now, 4 decades into their work. "You did right telling me," I said. That evening I noticed something I hadn't registered before. When Lena introduced me to a delivery driver that afternoon, a brief exchange at the bottom of the driveway, she said, "This is Noel's mum. She stays in the cabin. Not my mother-in-law, not the owner of this property. Noel's mum. Someone attached. Someone already in the past tense." I went back to my cabin and I opened a notebook. I wrote down everything: dates, conversations, the photographs removed from the mantle, what Nell had told me. Small things that seemed unimportant individually and formed a clear pattern together. The survey stakes appeared on a Tuesday. Orange-tipped, newly driven, running in an uneven line from the back fence toward the tree line. I counted 7. I crouched and pressed one between my fingers. The wood was fresh. Someone had been on this property with instruments, measuring ground, that wasn't theirs to measure. Near the barn, I found a man in a collared shirt with a tablet photographing the building from several angles. He was capturing the cabin too, my cabin. I stepped forward. "Can I help you?" He looked up. "Just doing a site assessment." Before he could explain further, Lena's voice came from behind me. She crossed the yard as if she had every right to be standing between me and an answer. She said he was from a landscaping consultation firm. She said it was routine. She said I didn't need to worry about it. "Landscaping doesn't require photographs of my cabin," I said. The man, he said his name was Trent Beckham, looked at Lena rather than at me. Something passed between them. He made an excuse about another appointment and left quickly. I turned to Lena. "What are you planning?" "Upgrades," she said. "Things that increase value." "For whom?" She smiled the way a person smiles when they've decided the conversation is already over. "For the family." I did not argue further, not because I agreed. Because I had begun to understand that arguing with Lena in the open would give her something to point to later. I was not going to give her that. That afternoon I went to find the property documents. Vernon had kept them in a fireproof box in the main house office. When I opened the cabinet, the box was gone. Lena said Noel had reorganized the files. Noel said he hadn't touched them. I called my friend Opal Decker the next morning. Opal had spent 23 years as a clerk in the Frontenac County Township office before retiring. She knew land records the way Vernon knew wood grain. I drove to her house and told her everything from the beginning. The survey stakes, Trent Beckham, the missing documents, what Nell had overheard. Opal listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "First thing, go to the township office and pull every filing tied to your property, everything from the last 2 years." "Can she do anything without my signature?" I asked. Opal's expression shifted in a way I didn't like. "Not legally," she said, "but there are people who don't let that stop them." At the township office the following morning, the clerk handed me a folder of recent filings. I took it to a corner table. Most of it was familiar. The original deed, the tax assessments, the conservation easement Vernon had registered decades ago. Then I reached a document filed 8 months earlier, a preliminary consultation notice for a proposed residential subdivision. My name was at the bottom, my signature. I read it again, then again. The signature had the shape of mine, the curve of the H, the way the letters connected. But it was slightly too careful. Someone had practiced it. I photographed every page on my phone. I went back to the counter and requested certified copies. I walked to my car and called Opal. "She's already filed something," I said. Opal was quiet for a moment. "That's fraud," she said. "That's serious." "I know." "Don't confront her," she said immediately. "Not yet. Document everything first. And you need to see a lawyer." I already had one in mind. Vernon had worked with Delia Brandt for the last years of his life. I had her number still in the address book he kept in his workshop. The workshop Lena had since locked. Delia answered herself, recognized Vernon's name immediately, and told me to come that afternoon. Sitting across from Delia Brandt, I laid out everything: the forged filing, the survey stakes, the missing property documents, what Nell had overheard, the man named Trent Beckham photographing the barn. Delia didn't rush through any of it. When I finished, She opened a drawer and removed a file with Vernon's name on it. It was thicker than I expected. "Your husband was a careful man," she said. She walked me through what was inside. The property deed listed me as sole owner. Vernon had been specific about this, had updated the language in his final months. A conservation easement registered with the township protected a portion of the land, including the orchard, from residential development. Any subdivision of the back acreage required not only my written consent, but review by the Conservation Authority. "She can't move forward without your signature," Delia said. "A real one." "She's already submitted a forged one," I said. Delia's expression stayed calm but precise. "Then she's exposed herself. We wait until the right moment to let her know that. When she schedules the signing, that's when we step forward, not before." She closed the file. "Your husband didn't leave this in your hands by accident." I left her office, holding the certified copies of Vernon's documents. As I pulled into the driveway, Lena was on the back porch, watching me get out of the car. "Where were you?" she asked. "Errands," I said. She studied me. "You could have said something." "I didn't think I needed permission," I said, and I kept walking. 2 days later, I found a glossy brochure slipped under my cabin door. Sunrise Senior Living, full care services, private suites, warm and supportive community. A small sticky note in Lena's handwriting was attached. "Thought this might be worth looking into, just keeping our options open." I set it on the table. I looked at it for a long time. She wasn't just trying to take the land. She was building a story. First I was forgetful. Then I was a liability. Then I was someone who needed to be somewhere else. Each step made the next one easier. I opened my notebook. I wrote, "She is planning to replace me." Noel left the next morning for a week-long project in Calgary. He hugged me and said to call if I needed anything. I watched him drive away. Lena stood on the porch watching him too, and she didn't look back at me. That evening, through the window, I saw Lena setting up tables in the yard near the barn. String lights being hung between the apple trees. Chairs arranged. Someone else carrying a folding table from the garage. I watched from my cabin until the lights came on and voices carried faintly through the dark. I did not go through the main gate. I changed into darker clothes. I took my phone and the old key from the hook by my cabin door, the key to the farm lane gate that Vernon had kept on a separate ring, labeled in his handwriting. "Back easement." I walked to the rear of the property, where the tree line thickened, and the old lane was barely visible beneath years of overgrowth. I pushed through the brush and found the lane just where it had always been. Narrower now, but clear enough. I followed it to the small iron gate at the property's rear corner. The key turned with some resistance, rust and time, and then the gate swung open without argument. I was inside my own property, standing behind the barn, in the dark, with the string lights glowing 30 meters ahead, and voices drifting through the apple trees. I moved slowly, staying close to the barn wall. I could see the tables now. Documents spread across the surface. Trent Beckham was there in a sport coat, speaking with a woman I didn't recognize. Lena stood at the center of it all, confident in the way people are when they believe every variable is controlled. I pressed record on my phone. "The subdivision would be registered in 3 phases, Trent Beckham said. "The orchard goes in phase 1. "I know," Lena said. "And the current resident?" the woman asked. "She'll be at Sunrise by the time phase 1 breaks ground," Lena said. "I've already started the process." "And Noel?" "He signs Saturday when he's back," Lena said. "He trusts me completely. He doesn't need every detail." She paused. "His mother won't be a problem. She thinks she's already lost." I stood in the dark and let her keep talking. Every word, every figure, every casual assumption about what I would do and where I would go. I stayed until I had enough. Then I walked back through the lane, through the iron gate, and locked it behind me. I spent the rest of that night at my table, with everything in front of me. Past midnight, I went quietly to the barn through the lane again, and found what I had suspected. Boxes of development paperwork, copies of my driver's license and personal documents, the preliminary subdivision plans, detailed and color-coded, and there, wrapped in a cloth and pushed behind Vernon's old band saw, his workshop journal, the one I thought had been misplaced after he died. I sat on his work stool and opened it. The first half was what I expected. Orchard notes, carpentry measurements, a running list of repairs the barn needed. Then the entries changed. His handwriting slowed and became more deliberate, the way it did when he was writing something he wanted to last. I don't trust Lena, he had written. She doesn't look at this land and see a home. She looks at it and sees a number. My chest tightened. I kept reading. If anything happens to me, I worry Hilda will give too much away. She is generous to a fault, and she loves Noel, and that combination makes her vulnerable. I have spoken with Delia Brandt. The documents are in order. The easement is registered. The conservation covenant is registered. Hilda owns this property fully, and it cannot be developed without her consent. And then, on the final page, if Hilda reads this, it means I was right to make these arrangements. She must not stay silent. Silence will cost her everything. I closed the journal and put it in my bag. The next morning, I called Noel in Calgary. I told him I needed to see him before Saturday, and that it was important, and that I needed him to listen before he responded to anything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, Mum. Friday night." Friday evening, his truck came up the driveway at dusk. He came directly to the cabin. I opened the door before he knocked. We sat at my table. He looked tired and already braced the way people brace when they sense they are about to hear something they've been avoiding. I showed him everything. The forged filing at the township. The photographs of the development documents in the barn. The subdivision plan with the orchard marked for Phase 1. The Sunrise Senior Living brochure with Lena's handwriting on it. I pressed play on the recording and Lena's voice filled the small kitchen. He doesn't need every detail. His mother won't be a problem. Noel sat very still. I set Vernon's journal in front of him and opened it to the final pages. He looked at his father's handwriting for a long moment. Something in his face changed. Not all at once, but steadily, the way light changes in a room when clouds clear. "He knew," Noel said quietly. "Yes." He closed the journal. He didn't speak for a while. Then, I found accounts I didn't recognize. Last spring, credit lines I hadn't opened. I asked her about them. She said it was a short-term rental investment that didn't work out. She needed this land to cover it, I said. He looked away. I should have pressed harder. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. "Don't sign anything tomorrow," I said, "and show up." He nodded. Saturday morning, the string lights went back up in the orchard. Trent Beckham's car arrived, mid-afternoon. The woman from the gathering was there again. Lena moved through the preparations with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. Noel walked through the front gate with Nell beside him at 4 o'clock. I waited until I heard the papers being arranged on the table, the sound of a gathering settling into its purpose. Then, I walked through the farm lane, through the iron gate, along the back of the barn, and came around the line of northern spy trees into the orchard. I stepped into the gathering from the inside. The silence happened all at once. Lena looked at me, the way you look at something you were certain you had already accounted for. "This is my property," I said. "I think we should be clear about that before anyone signs anything." I set the documents on the table. The deed, the conservation covenant, the registered easement, a letter from Delia Brandt summarizing the legal protections Vernon had put in place. The woman, Petra Huang, a development attorney, as I later learned, reached for the documents and began reading. Her expression changed quickly. "This property is solely owned by the woman standing in front of you," she said. She looked at Lena, "and there is a conservation covenant on the orchard section. No residential development in this area without owner consent and conservation authority review." Trent Beckham set down his pen. "You told me there were no encumbrances on the back acreage." "The preliminary consultation filing was exploratory," Lena said. Her voice was still controlled, but only just. I placed the forged filing beside the deed. "This signature isn't mine," I said. "I have documentation to support that. And I have a recording made Thursday evening of this property being discussed as though I had no standing to oppose any of it." The gathering went very quiet. Noel spoke without looking at Lena. "I'm not signing anything today." She turned toward him. "Noel." "I'm not signing anything," he said again. Final. Nell stepped forward then. She had her own phone in her hand. I hadn't known she had made her own recording. I hadn't asked her to. She pressed play and her mother's voice came through clearly. Once Noel signs, it's done. She won't be a problem much longer. Trent Beckham picked up his folder. We need to pause this entirely, he said quietly to Petra Huang. She nodded. They collected their materials and walked toward the driveway without looking back. Murray Croft, the neighbor who had farmed the adjacent land for 30 years and held his own right to use the registered easement lane, had been standing near the gate. I had called him that morning. He noted the unauthorized survey stakes and began filing a formal complaint with the township that same afternoon. Lena stood near the table as the gathering dissolved around her. The string lights were still on in the trees. The papers were still arranged on the surface, going nowhere. I walked over to her, not in anger. Anger had moved through me and passed. You needed help, I said. You could have asked. She looked at me. Something moved across her face, not quite shame, not quite grief, but something in the space between them. You would have said no, she said. You never gave me the chance to say yes. She didn't answer. There was no answer that made what she had done smaller, and I think she knew it. The township filed a formal inquiry into the forged preliminary consultation. Delia Brandt handled the legal response. The process moved carefully through its proper channels over the months that followed. I will not tell you it was swift. I will tell you it was thorough. I will tell you it was, and that every piece of documentation I had gathered mattered in ways I couldn't have predicted when I was writing alone at my table at midnight. Noel moved into the spare room of the main house. He and Lena did not resolve things easily or quickly, and that part of the story belongs to them more than it belongs to me. Nell spent more evenings in the cabin, and that part, at least, felt right. By the following October, the orchard was ready for its last picking of the season. Noel came out one morning without being asked. He walked up the row of courtlands and started gathering fallen apples the way he used to as a boy, checking them for bruising, setting aside the good ones. I worked beside him, and we didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying yet. At some point, he stopped in front of the ambrosia tree. Nell's tree, the one Vernon had planted the year she was born, and stood there with both hands resting on one of the lower branches. I should have paid attention, he said. Yes, I said. I didn't say it to wound him. I said it because it was true, and we were past the point where softening it would help either of us. Can we fix this? He asked. Some of it, I said. The parts that matter. We kept working. The orchard smelled the way it always does in late October, cold air and ripe fruit, and something older underneath. The particular smell of land that has been tended for a long time by people who meant it. The barn door code was reset. I have it now. I go in and out as I need to. Vernon's tools are where he left them. His journal is on the shelf above his workbench, where I can see it when I go in to work. The old iron gate in the farm lane is still there. The lock still works. The key still hangs inside my cabin door on Vernon's ring, labeled in his handwriting. I left it because I don't want to forget what it opened. It opened more than a gate at the back of an orchard. It opened the part of me that had gone quiet for too long, the part that had decided keeping peace was more important than protecting what was mine. Vernon knew me well enough to know I might need another way in. He put that easement in the ground decades ago and never explained why it would matter the way it did. But he saw what things might become, the way he always did. He planted for the long season. And in the end, it wasn't the lane itself that saved this place. It was the moment I stopped walking away from the locked door and started looking for what he had left me. If you were standing where I was standing, what would you have done? Would you have spoken sooner or waited until every piece was in place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and if this story stayed with you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to Silent Tears Stories. These are the things people don't always say out loud. I think they deserve to be heard.